Welcome back to our channel. In this video, we explore the terrifying secrets of Deck Zero and other true Reddit horror stories from the deep ocean. These real-life encounters will make you rethink your next vacation. Story 1. They tell you the ocean is empty, but they never tell you what the ship keeps in its basement to stay afloat. I'm Elias Thorne, a 28-year-old freelance photojournalist currently drifting somewhere in the dark expanse between the Cayman Islands and the coast of Mexico. I'm writing this from a cramped cabin on the Azure Monarch, a vessel that's supposed to be the pinnacle of luxury, but right now, it feels more like a floating coffin. My job usually involves capturing the high life. The golden hour glints on champagne flutes and the forced smiles of the ultra-wealthy. But what I saw 3 hours ago has changed the way I look at the water forever. It started with a glitch in the elevator. I had spent the evening in the observation lounge on Deck 12, trying to coax a bit of soul out of a sunset that looked more like a postcard than reality. By midnight, the air had turned cold, and the crowds had thinned out to a few drunks and the skeletal night crew. I stepped into elevator 4, intending to head down to my cabin on Deck 7. I pressed the button, the doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss, and the floor began to drop. But it didn't stop at 7. The digital display flickered, the red numbers dancing in a sequence that didn't make sense. 7, 6, 5, 2, 1, and then a blank space. A zero that wasn't a zero, but a void. The elevator didn't jerk, it just kept descending, the hum of the engine deepening into a guttural growl that I felt in my molars. When the doors finally opened, the air that hit me wasn't the recycled, lemon-scented oxygen of the guest floors. It was heavy. It was thick with the smell of brine, old copper, and something sweet, like lilies left to rot in a vase of stagnant water. I stepped out, my camera bag heavy on my shoulder, thinking I'd stumbled into a maintenance level. But there were no pipes, no industrial boilers, no busy crew members in jumpsuits. This was a hallway, identical in architecture to the luxury corridors above, but stripped of its soul. The plush teal carpets were gone, replaced by floorboards that looked warped and damp. The wallpaper, once cream and gold, was peeling away in long, wet strips, revealing dark, pulsing mold underneath. The silence was the worst part. On a ship this size, there's always a vibration, a heartbeat. Here, the heartbeat was gone. It was just me and the sound of my own breath, which was coming out in ragged white plumes. I pulled my Nikon from my bag. The familiar weight grounded me. I clicked the power on, the small green light, the only beacon in the dimness. I began to walk. The corridor stretched on for what felt like miles, far longer than the actual length of the ship. Every 20 feet there was a door. No room numbers, just brass plates that had been polished so hard the names were worn down to illegible smears. I reached the end of the hall and found a set of double mahogany doors. They were slightly ajar. A faint, rhythmic sound drifted through the gap, slap, drag, slap, drag. It sounded like wet fabric being pulled across a stone floor. I pushed the doors open. The room was a ballroom, a grand, circular space that should have been the crown jewel of the ship. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, but they weren't glowing with electricity. They were encrusted with salt and barnacles, dripping slow, rhythmic tears of seawater onto the floor below, and the floor. The floor was covered in 6 inches of dark, shimmering water, but it wasn't the water that stopped my heart. It was the people. There were hundreds of them, men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns that might have been beautiful 20 years ago. They were all standing perfectly still, arranged in pairs as if waiting for the music to start. Their backs were to me. I stood there, frozen, the water lapping at the toes of my boots. "Hello," I whispered. My voice didn't echo. It was swallowed by the dampness. None of them moved. I took a step forward, the splash of my foot echoing like a gunshot. I reached out and touched the shoulder of a man standing nearest to me. His suit jacket was sodden, heavy with the weight of the ocean. As my fingers brushed the fabric, he didn't turn. He tilted. He tipped backward slowly like a felled tree and hit the water with a heavy, wet thud. He didn't splash like a person should. He hit the surface and stayed there, floating face up. I looked down. His skin wasn't pale. It was translucent, stretched tight over bone and filled with a faint bluish fluid. His eyes were wide open, devoid of pupils, just milky white orbs staring at the salt-crusted ceiling. His mouth was open in a silent O, and as he bobbed in the wake of my movement, a small silver fish darted out from between his teeth. He had been drowned. They had all been drowned. I backed away, my breath hitching in my throat, but my professional instinct, that morbid cursed curiosity, made me raise my camera. I fired the flash. Crack. For a split second, the room was illuminated in a harsh artificial white. They weren't just standing there. Their feet weren't touching the floor. They were suspended, tethered to the ground by thin, rusted chains attached to their ankles, and they weren't dead in the way I understood death. When the flash hit, 100 pairs of those milky eyes didn't reflect the light. They absorbed it, and then the music started. It wasn't coming from speakers, it was coming from the walls, a distorted, bubbling rendition of a waltz, sounding like a record player being operated underwater. The bodies began to move. It wasn't a dance, it was a mockery of one. The current in the room, stirred by some invisible force, began to swirl, and the tethered corpses swayed in unison. Slap, drag, slap, drag. Their limbs moved with the fluid grace of seaweed. The woman in the tattered red dress next to me raised her arm, her hand shriveled and gray brushing against my cheek. Her skin was ice cold and felt like wet leather. I turned to run, but the doors I had entered through were gone. In their place was a solid wall of that weeping, moldy wallpaper. I was trapped on deck 0. I began to wade through the water, pushing past the floating gala of the damned. Every time I brushed against one of them, they would lean into me, their weight heavy and suffocating. I found a small alcove near the far end of the ballroom, a bar area where the bottles were filled with sand and seawater. On the counter sat a leather-bound logbook. I grabbed it, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped my camera into the rising water. I flipped it open. The pages were damp, but the ink was a deep, fresh black. October 14th, 1994, the first entry read, "The SSA Aurora has reached capacity. The harvest is prepared. The guests believe they are sailing for the sun, but we know the depths require their due. One deck for the living, one deck for the dead." The Azure Monarch wasn't always the Azure Monarch. I remembered the rumors now, the stories of a sister ship that vanished in the 90s, 3,000 souls lost without a trace. They hadn't vanished. They had been renamed. And they were still here, tucked away in the belly of the beast, serving as the literal ballast for the luxury above. I heard a new sound then, a heavy, metallic clanking. The crew was coming. From the shadows at the edge of the ballroom, figures emerged. They weren't bloated like the dancers. They were gaunt, wearing the outdated white uniforms of the Aurora. Their skin was a sickly, bruised purple, and their movements were twitchy, mechanical. They carried long, hooked poles, the kind used to pull debris from a harbor. They began to hook the floating bodies, dragging them toward a large, dark aperture in the floor that I hadn't noticed before. A drain. One of them stopped. He turned his head, a slow, clicking motion, and looked directly at me. He didn't have eyes. Where his eyes should have been, 2 large, black sea urchins had burrowed into the sockets, their spines twitching in the damp air. He raised a finger to his blue lips. "Shh, then..." He pointed his hook at me. I didn't think. I lunged for a service ladder I saw behind the bar, scrambling up the rusted rungs as the water below began to churn. I could hear them splashing after me, that rhythmic slap drag accelerating into a frenzied pace. I climbed until my lungs burned, until the smell of salt was replaced by the smell of diesel and grease. I burst through a hatch and found myself in a small, cramped storage closet on deck 4. I slammed the hatch shut and bolted it, collapsing onto a pile of extra linens, sobbing and gasping for air. I stayed there for hours. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the ship was bathed in the soft golden light of morning. I walked back to my cabin, passing happy families on their way to breakfast, elderly couples holding hands, and children running down the halls. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked expensive. But as I stood in my cabin shower, trying to scrub the smell of the depths off my skin, I looked down at the drain. The water was swirling away, clear and harmless. But then, a single black sea urchin spine washed out of my hair and circled the drain before disappearing into the dark. I looked at my camera sitting on the vanity. The memory card was corrupted. Every photo I took on deck 0 was gone, replaced by a single grainy image of a dark underwater void, except for one, the logbook. I had shoved it into my jacket. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling as I opened it to the last page. It wasn't an entry from 1994. The ink was still wet, smearing across the page in a frantic hand. August 22nd, 25, it read, today's date. The photographer has seen the debt. He is no longer a guest, he is a deposit. I'm sitting on my bed now watching the door. The handle just turned, a slow metallic click, and from the hallway I can hear it. Slap, drag, slap, drag. It's salty, and it smells like rot. If you're reading this, don't go looking for the hidden decks. The ship doesn't just sail on the ocean, it feeds on it, and I think it's finally time for me to pay my fare. Story 2. If you ever see a door on a cruise ship with 4 heavy industrial deadbolts mounted on the outside, don't ask the staff what's behind it, just jump overboard, because the freezing Atlantic is a mercy compared to what's breathing on the other side of that wood. I'm Marcus, a 29-year-old former Maritime security officer, and right now I'm writing this from a windowless basement apartment in a small town in Oregon, 300 miles from the nearest coastline. I spent 5 years in the Navy and another 3 doing private security for some of the wealthiest shipping magnates in the world, so I'm not exactly a man who scares easily. I've seen storms that could snap a destroyer in half and dealt with pirates off the coast of Somalia who had nothing left to lose. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for my final contract on the Emma's Hyperion. The Hyperion wasn't your average carnival ship. It was a boutique ultra-luxury vessel. The kind of place where the passenger manifest included tech CEOs, disgraced royalty, and people whose names you'd only find on leaked offshore banking documents. When I was hired, the salary was double the industry standard. I should have known then. When the pay is that high for static security, you aren't being paid for your muscles. You're being paid for your silence and your potential as a sacrificial lamb. My post was simple, or so they told me. I was assigned to the captain's corridor on Deck 12, but here's the thing about the Hyperion. The elevators didn't go to Deck 12. To get there, you had to use a service key and a hidden panel in the service lift. The hallway was narrow, lined with plush blood-red carpeting that seemed to swallow the sound of your footsteps, and lit by flickering sconces that gave the whole place a sickly amber glow. There was only one door in that entire hallway. It was made of solid, dark oak, and it was reinforced with 4 heavy steel deadbolts. All of them were on the outside. "Your job is simple, Thorne," Chief Security Officer Miller had told me on my first day. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of old leather in regret. He wouldn't look me in the eye when he handed me the heavy ring of keys. "You stand at the end of the hall. You don't talk to the passengers, because there aren't any on this deck. You don't open that door. And most importantly, you do not, under any circumstances, look through the peephole after 2000 am." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of hazing ritual. Miller didn't laugh. He just gripped my shoulder with a hand that was shaking just a little and whispered, "The captain is a very private man. He likes his solitude. If you hear him talking, ignore it. If you hear him scratching, ignore it. Just stay on your feet and wait for the sun." First 3 nights were uneventful, if you count creeping existential dread as uneventful. The Hyperion was a massive ship, but on Deck 12 you couldn't hear the engines, you couldn't hear the waves. It was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I'd spend 12 hours a night staring at that door. Around 3000 am every night, the temperature would plummet. I'm talking about seeing your own breath cold, and then the sounds would start. It began with a soft thud, like someone dropping a heavy book, then a slow, rhythmic dragging sound, as if something heavy and wet was being pulled across the floorboards inside the cabin. Slither, thump, thump. I told myself it was just the ship settling. I told myself the captain was probably just an eccentric old billionaire with a weird hobby. Maybe he had a large dog, but dogs don't whisper. On the 4th night, the whispering started. I was leaning against the far wall, nursing a thermos of black coffee when I heard it. It wasn't coming from the door exactly. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves, a low, wet sibilance that crawled into my ears. My heart stopped. The voice was thin, like parchment tearing, and it sounded exactly like my mother. My mother had been dead for 6 years. "Elias, it's so dark in here. Won't you let me out? The bolts are so heavy." I dropped my coffee. The plastic thermos clattered on the red carpet, the sound muffled and dead. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over my sidearm. I knew it wasn't her. I knew it was impossible. But the voice, it had the exact same lilt, the same way she'd say my name when I was a kid, and I'd woken up from a nightmare. "It's just a trick of the acoustics," I hissed to myself, my voice trembling. "The wind in the vents, that's all." "It's not the wind, Elias," the voice whispered, now right against the wood of the door. "It's so cold, he's eating the light. Please, just one bolt, just the top one." I didn't move. I remembered Miller's face. I remembered the way he looked like a man waiting for a death sentence. I stayed at the end of the hall, my back pressed against the elevator doors, until the sun came up and the day shift. A silent, hulking guy named Merrick came to relieve me. Merrick didn't say a word. He just took the keys, checked the bolts, and stood where I had stood. He looked like he'd already died inside. The fifth night was when the storm hit. This wasn't just a squall, it was a North Atlantic monster. The Hyperion, for all its size, began to heave. The hallway on deck 12 tilted dangerously. I had to brace myself against the walls just to stay upright. The lights in the sconces flickered, turned red, and then died completely, leaving me in total, suffocating darkness. Then, the emergency red lights kicked in, casting the hallway in a hellish, strobing crimson. That's when the banging started. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a violent, frenzied drumming against the oak door. Boom. Boom. The wood groaned. The steel bolts rattled in their housings. Whatever was inside wasn't just a man. No human being could hit a door with that much force without breaking every bone in their hand. And then, the smell hit me. It was the smell of a 1,000-year-old tide pool, rotting kelp, stagnant salt water, and the metallic tang of old blood. It seeped through the cracks in the door, thick and oily. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I nearly retched. "Let me out!" A voice roared. It wasn't my mother anymore. It was 1,000 voices at once, men, women, children, all screaming in a discordant, wet harmony. The ship took a massive lurch to the port side. I was thrown off my feet, sliding down the red carpet toward the door. I scrambled to get away, my boots slipping on the fabric, and that's when I saw it. The bottommost bolt, the heavy steel bar. It was sliding. Slowly, agonizingly, the bolt was being pulled back. But it wasn't being pulled from the outside. Something was reaching through the gap between the door and the frame. Something thin, translucent, and tipped with a black, hooked claw, and it was fumbling with the mechanism. I scrambled backward, my lungs burning. I reached for my radio, but all I got was static. "Oh, Miller, come in. The door. Something's opening the door." Static. And then, a voice over the radio. It was Miller, but he sounded like he was miles away. "I'm sorry, Thorne. We needed someone with a strong heart. The captain. He hasn't fed in a long time. The storm always makes him hungry." The second bolt clicked open. I pulled my Glock 17 and aimed it at the door. My hands were shaking so hard I had to use both to steady the weapon. "I'll shoot. I swear to God, I'll shoot." The screaming inside the cabin stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I could hear the ship's hull groaning under the pressure of the waves, but in that hallway the air felt thick, like I was underwater. Then, a soft, wet thud against the wood. "Elias." The voice was different now. It was soft, seductive. It sounded like a woman I'd loved in my early 20s, a girl named Sarah who had moved away and broken my heart. "Elias, look through the hole. I want you to see me. I'm so beautiful now. No more skin to hide what I really am. Just look." I knew I shouldn't. Every instinct in my body, every year of military training told me to run. But the hallway was a dead end. The elevator required a key I didn't have the presence of mind to use, and the stairs were behind the door. I was trapped. And God help me, I was curious. It's the curse of our species, isn't it? We see the abyss, and we want to know how deep it goes. I crept forward, my boots squelching on the carpet, which was now inexplicably wet. I reached the door. The smell was overpowering now, a physical weight on my chest. I leaned in, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I put my eye to the brass peephole. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, deep, absolute black. Then the darkness moved. An eye opened on the other side. It wasn't a human eye. It was massive, the size of a dinner plate, with a horizontal, rectangular pupil like a goat's. The iris was a swirling nebula of bioluminescent gold and sickly green. It didn't have eyelids. It just existed, staring back at me with an intelligence that was so old and so cold it felt like a physical blow to my brain. Behind the eye, I saw a glimpse of the captain's cabin. It wasn't a room. It was a cavern. The walls of the ship seemed to have peeled away into an impossible space filled with seawater and giant, swaying stalks of something that looked like human nerves. And there, suspended in the center of the room, was the captain. He or it was a mass of pale, translucent flesh, a grotesque fusion of a man and something from the Hadal zone. Dozens of elongated, multi-jointed limbs sprouted from a central torso that was ribbed like a whale's throat. His face, the captain's face, was still there. A tiny, withered human head perched atop the mountain of eldritch meat. His eyes were stitched shut with silver wire, but the massive eye, the one staring at me, was embedded in the center of his chest. The thing grinned, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth that went back into its throat for miles. "Found you," it gurgled. The third bolt slammed open. I didn't think. I didn't pray. I just turned and ran. I didn't go for the elevator. I knew Miller had locked it. I ran toward the small service locker at the end of the hall, a tiny closet meant for mops and cleaning chemicals. I dived inside, pulling the door shut and jamming a mop handle through the door's grip just as the fourth bolt on the captain's door clicked. The sound of the oak door hitting the wall echoed through the hallway like a cannon shot. I huddled in the dark, surrounded by the smell of bleach and floor wax, clutching my pistol to my chest. I heard it come out. It didn't walk. It flowed. It sounded like a wet carpet being dragged over a gravel pit. Slurp, thump, slurp, thump. The temperature in the closet dropped so low the bleach bottles began to crack. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming as I heard the thing stop right outside my door. "I can smell your fear, Elias," the voices whispered in unison. "It smells like copper and ozone. It smells delicious." The closet door creaked. The mop handle groaned under the pressure of something pushing from the other side. I pressed my back against the rear wall, wishing I had saved a bullet for myself. I saw a pale, multi-jointed finger, 6 inches long and dripping with black bile, poke through the gap in the door frame. It felt around, searching for the handle. "Come out, Elias. The captain needs a new navigator." The last one wore out. I closed my eyes and squeezed the trigger of my Glock. Bang! 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 The shots were deafening in the small space. I fired until the slide locked back, the muzzle flashes illuminating the closet in brief, violent bursts. Through the bullet holes in the door, I saw flashes of that pale, translucent flesh. It didn't bleed red. It bled a thick, glowing blue ichor that hissed when it hit the floor. The thing let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a frequency. A low decibel hum that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. And then I heard Miller's voice from the hallway. "That's enough, Captain. He's spoiled now. The adrenaline ruins the flavor. We'll find you another in the next port." The pressure on the door vanished. The wet dragging sound receded, moving back toward the captain's cabin. I heard the oak door swing shut. I heard the bolts being slid back into place. 1, 2, 3, 4. I stayed in that closet for 6 hours. I didn't move when the ship stopped tossing. I didn't move when the lights came back on. I only moved when the door to the closet was ripped open by Merrick. He looked at me, then at the bullet holes in the door, then back at me. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. "You're lucky," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Most of them try to run for the stairs. He likes it when they run." They didn't kill me. I think they were afraid of the paperwork. Instead, they took me to the infirmary, pumped me full of sedatives, and when we docked in Southampton, 2 company men escorted me to the gangplank. They handed me a thick envelope full of cash, more money than I'd ever seen in my life, and a non-disclosure agreement that was 10 pages long. "If you talk," one of them said, "the Hyperion will find you, and the captain, he doesn't forget a cent." I bought a plane ticket to the most inland place I could find. I changed my name. I don't go near the ocean. I don't even like taking long showers anymore. But sometimes, at 3000 am, the temperature in my apartment drops. I'll be lying in bed, staring at the shadows, and I'll hear it. A soft, rhythmic dragging sound coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. Slither, thump, slither, thump. And then, a voice thin, wet, and sounding just like my mother, whispers through the keyhole. "Holius, it's so dark in here. Won't you let me in?" I've installed 4 industrial deadbolts on my bedroom door. They're all on the inside. But every morning when I wake up, I check them, and one of them is always halfway open. If you're planning a cruise this summer, do yourself a favor. Check the deck plans. If there's a deck that the elevator doesn't go to, or a hallway that feels just a little too quiet, don't be curious. Don't look through the peephole. Because some things are meant to be bolted shut, and some captains aren't sailing the ship. They're just waiting for the next person to stand guard. Story 3. The ocean doesn't just swallow ships. Sometimes it invites them in with a voice that sounds exactly like home. I'm Coffee, a 42-year-old former senior communications officer for Global Maritime Logistics. For 22 years, my world was defined by the crackle of shortwave radio, the rhythmic pulse of sonar, and the endless, oppressive blue of the Pacific. I've seen rogue waves the size of office buildings and bioluminescent blooms that make the sea look like a fallen galaxy. But I'm writing this from a cabin deep in the Oregon woods, miles from the nearest coastline, because I can't stand the sound of a moving tide anymore. Not after what I heard at 37, 1 degrees south, 49, 5 degrees west. They call it the ghost signal. To the public, it's a footnote in maritime mystery forums, right next to the Mary Celeste or the Bermuda Triangle. But to those of us who spent our lives behind a headset in the middle of the dark, it's a death sentence. Over the last 70 years, exactly 50 vessels, from massive iron-hulled tankers to nimble research yachts, have vanished at those exact coordinates. No wreckage, no oil slicks, no bodies. Just a final, identical radio transmission that the Navy keeps locked behind a classified stamp. It started for me in the winter of 2012. I was stationed aboard the MV Persephone, a 300-meter container ship crossing from Valparaiso to Sydney. We were cutting through a stretch of the South Pacific so remote that the closest humans to us were the astronauts on the International Space Station. It's a place where the silence is heavy. It presses against your eardrums until you start hearing things, your own heartbeat, the groaning of the hull, the ghosts of old conversations. I was on the graveyard shift 3000 AM, surrounded by the green glow of the monitors. The radio was silent, just the usual background hiss of the ionosphere. Then it happened. A spike on the spectrum analyzer, a clean, sharp signal at 12. Fork Jose. It didn't sound like a radio transmission. It sounded like someone was sitting right behind me, whispering into the nape of my neck. "Please," the voice said. It was a woman, her tone flat, devoid of the panic you'd expect from a distress call. "Why did you wait so long to join us?" My blood turned to ice. I checked the radar. There was nothing for 500 miles. I checked our GPS. We were approaching the dead zone, a patch of water where the 1954 disappearance of the Kuro Maru had occurred. The Kuro Maru was the first of the 50. It had been a Japanese freighter carrying industrial equipment. Their last log entry was a single sentence: "The signal is beautiful today." I tried to tune the frequency out, but the dial wouldn't budge. The digital display on my console began to flicker, the numbers spinning wildly before settling on a single coordinate: 37, 1 49, 5 W's. "Captain, to the bridge," I whispered into the internal comms, my voice shaking. Captain Miller was a veteran, a man who had more salt in his veins than blood. When he walked in and heard the signal, he didn't ask questions. He turned pale, a sickly grayish color I'd never seen on him. He grabbed the headset, listened for 5 seconds, and ripped it off his ears. "Turn us around," he told the helmsman. "Sir?" The helmsman asked, confused. "We're on a schedule. If we deviate now, we lose 3 days." "Turn this ship around now," Miller screamed, but we didn't turn. The helm didn't respond. The Persephone, 60,000 tons of steel and cargo, was being pulled, not by a current and not by the wind. It was as if the water itself had become a conveyor belt, dragging us toward that invisible point on the map. I looked out the bridge window. The moon was high, casting a silver light over the swells. And then I saw them. At first I thought they were clouds or low-hanging mist. But as we got closer to the coordinates, the echoes became solid. They were ships, dozens of them. They weren't floating on the water, they were suspended in it, half merged with the surface. I saw the rusted prow of a 1940s destroyer. I saw the sleek white hull of a modern luxury yacht. I saw fishing trawlers with their nets still deployed, hanging in the air like cobwebs. They were all there. The 50 vanished ships, they weren't gone. They were caught, like flies in amber. The ghost signal grew louder, vibrating through the very floorboards of the bridge. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices, overlapping, singing a dissonant, haunting melody. They were calling the names of our crew. I heard my mother's voice. I heard a girl I'd known in high school. I heard the captain's late wife. "Look at the water," Miller whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. The sea around the coordinates wasn't blue or black anymore. It was a shimmering, oily gold. It looked thick, viscous. And beneath the surface, huge shapes were moving, not whales, not fish. They were geometric massive, glowing structures that looked like drowned skyscrapers. This is the part they don't tell you in the documentaries. The ghost signal isn't a glitch, it's a lure. Whatever lives down there, in the deepest trench of the Pacific, has learned how to fish for us. It uses our own technology against us. It broadcasts a frequency that interacts with the human brain's temporal lobe, creating hallucinations of loved ones, of safety, of home. It overrides the navigation systems of our ships, slaving them to its will. As we crossed the threshold of Fort Enai, 5 West, the engine room reported a total flameout. The lights died. We were drifting in that golden, silent soup. The ships around us, the ghosts were silent. I could see figures on their decks. People, they were standing perfectly still, staring at us. They weren't rotting. They didn't look like corpses. They looked like they were waiting for something. "We have to go into the water," the helmsman said. His voice was dreamy, his hands dropping from the wheel. "They're saying the pressure doesn't hurt. They're saying you can breathe the gold." He started walking toward the door. Captain Miller didn't stop him. Miller was staring at the radar screen, which was now just a solid block of white light. "Elias," the captain said softly. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what, sir?" I asked, backing away toward the emergency radio locker. "The heartbeat. The ocean has a heartbeat." I didn't wait. I knew if I stayed on that bridge for another minute, I'd be over the railing and into that golden oil. I scrambled for the emergency life raft, a self-contained, high-pressure pod designed for extreme conditions. I didn't think about the crew. I didn't think about my duty. I thought about the way the voice had said, "Join us." I triggered the release. The pod slammed into the viscous water with a dull thud. It didn't splash. It sank about 3 feet and then bobbed like a cork in syrup. Through the reinforced porthole, I watched the Persephone. The massive ship was tilting, not because it was taking on water, but because something from below was pulling it down by the keel. The golden light intensified, blinding me. The chorus of voices reached a screaming crescendo, a wall of sound that felt like it was peeling the skin off my bones. And then, silence. The light vanished. The golden tint of the water faded back into the dark, cold black of the night. I looked out the porthole, and the Persephone was gone. The 50 ships were gone. The horizon was empty, no debris, no bubbles, just the moon reflecting on a flat, indifferent sea. I drifted in that pod for 4 days before a Chilean Navy vessel picked me up. They found me screaming, my hands bloodied from clawing at the walls of the pod. They told me there was no record of the Persephone ever sending a distress signal. They told me that, according to their satellite tracking, the ship had simply ceased to exist at 03:14 a.m. I was interrogated for 3 months. Men in suits with no names asked me about the ghost signal. They showed me photos of the other vanished ships. They knew, they've always known. They call it the acoustic anomaly of Sector 7 Delta. They told me that if I ever spoke about the golden water or the underwater structures, I'd find myself back out there, on a boat with no engine and no radio. But I can't stay quiet, not anymore. Because 2 weeks ago, I bought a vintage shortwave radio for my cabin. I told myself it was for emergencies, for weather reports, but I knew why I bought it. I was addicted to the static. Last night, I was scrolling through the frequencies, the wind howling through the Oregon pines outside. I passed 12, Fort Jose. I stopped. The hiss died away. "Elias," the voice whispered. It was Captain Miller. He sounded younger, happier. "The water is so warm here. We're all waiting. We're still at the coordinates. We're just underneath." Then, the radio began to pulse. A rhythmic, heavy thud, a heartbeat. I smashed the radio with an axe and threw the pieces into the woods. But today, I noticed something. I live 300 miles from the Pacific. But when I turned on the kitchen faucet to wash my face, the water didn't come out clear. It was shimmering. It had a faint, oily golden tint. And when I pressed my ear to the drain, I didn't hear the sound of pipes. I heard the ocean, and it was calling my name. There are 50 ships at those coordinates, but they aren't looking for ships anymore. They're looking for the people who escaped. They're looking for me. If you're ever out on the water, and the radio starts to play a song you think you know, or you hear a voice that sounds like someone you lost, turn the boat around. Don't look at the water, don't listen to the heartbeat. Because once you hear the ghost signal, you're already part of the count, and they won't stop until they reach 51. It's the realization that the ocean isn't a body of water. It's a consciousness, a hungry, patient, and ancient mind that has found a way to bridge the gap between its world and ours through a simple frequency. I can hear the rain starting to hit the roof of my cabin now. It's heavy, it's rhythmic. It sounds like a pulse. I've locked the doors and plugged the drains, but I can feel the moisture in the air. It's thick, it's salty. I think I'll go for a walk. I've heard that the water is very warm this time of year, and I've kept them waiting long enough. If you find this, stay away from the deep. Stay away from the signal. The Pacific isn't empty. It's full of everyone we've ever lost, and they're all screaming for us to join them in the gold. I'm Elias Thorne, and this is my final transmission. If you hear this on 12 Porcles, please don't answer. Story 4. The water at 200 feet doesn't just crush your body, it crushes your sanity. But nothing prepared me for the sound of a ballroom violin playing through the static of my Sonar headset. I'm Michael, a 34-year-old commercial saturation diver currently stationed on a semi-submersible rig about 80 miles off the coast of the Florida Panhandle. For For the last decade, my life has been measured in atmospheres of pressure and the rhythmic hiss of a heliox mix. Down here, in the twilight zone, the sun is a myth, and the silence is supposed to be absolute. My job is usually mundane, inspecting pipeline welds or clearing debris from drill heads. But 3 weeks ago, a localized seismic shift opened a limestone shelf that hadn't seen the light of day in a century. The company called it a geological anomaly. I call it a grave that should have stayed closed. It started on a Tuesday. The current was unusually sluggish, a heavy, silt-laden crawl that made visibility even worse than usual. My partner Sarah was topside monitoring my vitals in the umbilical feed. I was swimming along the edge of a new trench, my powerful halogen torch cutting a lonely white beam through the soup of marine snow. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a rock formation. It was a corniced edge of white marble, shimmering like a ghost in the dark. I moved closer, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sound echoing in the confined space of my Kirby Morgan helmet. As I cleared the silt away with my gloved hand, the beam of my light hit glass. Thick, reinforced, leaded glass. Behind it was a room, not just a room, but a cavernous, opulent hall that defied every law of physics and decomposition I knew. "Sarah, you seeing this?" I whispered, my voice sounding metallic and thin. "I'm seeing a structure, Elias. Looks like stone. Wait, is that a window?" Her voice was crackling with interference. "The signal is getting weird. Check your O2 levels. You might be getting narked." I checked my gauges. Everything was green. I wasn't suffering from nitrogen narcosis. I was stone cold sober and staring at a pre-war ballroom submerged in 200 feet of salt water. I followed the line of the window until I found an arched doorway. The heavy oak doors had rotted away decades ago, leaving a gaping mouth that invited me into the belly of the beast. I shouldn't have gone in. Every safety protocol in the book says you don't enter an overhead environment without a guideline and a backup plan. But the curiosity was like a physical weight pulling me through the threshold. The moment I crossed the line into the ballroom, the temperature in my suit dropped. Not by a few degrees, but a bone-chilling plunge that made my teeth chatter. My torch beam swept across the ceiling. Massive crystal chandeliers hung like frozen jellyfish, their prisms still catching the light, refracting it into 1,000 tiny diamonds against the silted walls. And then I heard it. It wasn't a mechanical hum or the groan of shifting plates. It was music, a waltz. It was muffled, sounding as if it were being played through a thick wall of liquid, but the melody was unmistakable. High, soaring violins and the deep, rhythmic thrum of a cello. "Sarah, I have audio interference. It sounds like music. Please tell me the comms are picking this up." Silence. Sarah. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I was alone. I turned my torch toward the center of the floor. The silt here was thin, settled into the intricate patterns of a mosaic floor depicting a sunburst. And there, in the center of the room, they were. At first, I thought they were mannequins, or perhaps some macabre art installation left behind by a wealthy eccentric. There were dozens of them, pairs, locked in an eternal embrace. They wore the tattered remnants of what must have been exquisite evening wear. Silks that drifted like seaweed, tuxedos that had turned a sickly, mossy green. But they weren't floating. In the crushing pressure of 200 feet below, where any gas-filled cavity should have long since collapsed, these figures were standing upright. Their feet were planted firmly on the mosaic floor, and they were moving. It wasn't the chaotic swaying of a current, it was rhythmic. They were swaying in time with the music that only I could hear. A man in a rotted tailcoat spun a woman whose dress was nothing more than a skeletal frame of lace. As they turned, my light hit the woman's face. I expected a skull. I expected the hollow eyes of the long dead. What I saw was a face of porcelain perfection, her skin translucent and shimmering like the belly of a deep-sea fish. Her eyes were wide, fixed, and a brilliant glowing violet. She wasn't dead. She wasn't alive. She was something else, something the sea had claimed and rewritten. I froze, my thrusters kicking up a cloud of dust that threatened to swallow me. One of the couples drifted closer. They didn't swim. They glided across the floor, their movements fluid and graceful, defying the resistance of the water. As they passed through my light, I saw the gills, fine, feathery slits along their necks, pulsing in time with the music. The man looked at me. His eyes were like two black pearls, devoid of pupils. He didn't look surprised. He looked expectant. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and webbed with a fine, transparent membrane. "Elias, get out of there. Your heart rate is 160. Elias, respond." Sarah's voice exploded in my ear, distorted and frantic. I tried to back away, but my fins felt heavy, as if the water itself had turned to lead. The music was getting louder now, vibrating through the hull of my helmet, resonating in my very bones. It wasn't coming from speakers. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very water I was breathing. I looked up. The chandeliers were beginning to glow. A soft, bioluminescent green light began to bleed from the crystals, illuminating the entire hall. I could see the whole room now. There were hundreds of them. A sea of silent dancing ghosts, all moving to the same ghostly rhythm. The man in the tailcoat was inches from my faceplate now. He pressed his webbed hand against the glass. I could see the suction of his skin, the way his flesh seemed to hunger for the warmth of the air inside my helmet. He opened his mouth, and instead of a scream, a sequence of melodic bubbles escaped, rising slowly toward the ceiling. "Join us," the music seemed to whisper. "The pressure is only heavy until you let the water in." Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through my paralysis. I slammed my thrusters into reverse, the sudden jolt knocking me backward. I scrambled through the arched doorway, my umbilical cord snagging on a piece of jagged marble. I pulled frantically, feeling the sharp tug on my waist. "Sarah, pull me up. Emergency ascent. Now!" The winch is jammed. Something is holding the cable. I looked back. The man from the ballroom was holding my umbilical cord. He wasn't pulling it, he was just holding it, his black pearl eyes fixed on mine with a look of profound sadness. Behind him, the other dancers had stopped. They were all looking at me now. A gallery of beautiful, drowned monsters. The music reached a crescendo, a piercing, dissonant chord that made my ears bleed inside the helmet. I reached for my dive knife, the serrated steel gleaming in the green light. I didn't think about the decompression sickness. I didn't think about the bends that would likely kill me or leave me paralyzed if I cut my line and swam for the surface. I only thought about getting away from that beautiful rhythmic nightmare. I hacked at the cord. One stroke. The reinforced plastic and wire mesh groaned. On the third stroke, it snapped. The loss of the umbilical meant I was on my backup tank 10 minutes of air max, but I was free. I kicked, my legs screaming with the effort as I ascended through the dark. I didn't look back, but I could feel them. I could feel the vibration of their dance in the water below me, a pulse that seemed to match the frantic thumping of my heart. The ascent was a blur of pain and darkness. At 100 feet, the nitrogen started to bubble in my blood. My joints felt like they were being filled with molten lead. At 50 feet, the world started to go gray. I broke the surface screaming, the Florida sun blindingly bright. The recovery boat was there in seconds. Sarah's face a mask of horror as they hauled my convulsing body onto the deck and shoved me into the decompression chamber. I spent 4 days in that steel tube, watching the world through a small porthole, my body racked with the bends. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. They told me the music and the dancers were a hallucination, a classic case of high-pressure nervous syndrome combined with nitrogen narcosis. They said the structure I found was likely a natural rock formation that my mind had filled in with familiar imagery. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the way the man in the tailcoat looked at me, and they certainly couldn't explain what the deckhands found when they finally managed to haul up the severed end of my umbilical cord. The end of the cable wasn't jagged from my knife. It had been cleanly severed, but the plastic casing was covered in something, a fine, shimmering residue. When the lab analyzed it, they couldn't identify the proteins. All they could tell me was that it was bioluminescent and it responded to sound waves. I don't dive anymore. I can't even stand to be near a swimming pool. I live in a small apartment in the high desert of Nevada, as far from the ocean as I can get. But some nights when the wind howls through the canyons, it hits a certain frequency, a high, soaring note, the sound of a violin, and in the darkness of my bedroom I feel my feet start to itch. I feel a rhythmic swaying in my hips. I look in the mirror, and for a split second, I think I see a tint of violet in my eyes, and the faint, ghostly outline of gills beginning to open on my neck. The sea doesn't just take your life, it waits. It remembers the rhythm of your heart. And one day, I know the music will get loud enough that I'll start walking. I'll walk past the desert, past the dunes, and I won't stop until the water is over my head and the pressure feels like a warm, welcoming embrace. The dancers are still moving down there, and they've left a spot open on the floor just for me. Story 5. They tell you the midnight buffet is included in your ticket price, but they never mention who's actually paying the bill. I'm Elias, a 29-year-old former South chef, and for 3 years I worked the line on the SS Gorgon, a luxury megaliner that promised the world on a plate. I'm writing this from a cramped one-room cabin in the woods of northern Maine, 600 miles from the nearest coastline. I don't go near the ocean anymore. I don't even like the sound of a running faucet, because once you've seen what happens in the bowels of a cruise ship after the moon hits its peak and the regular guests are tucked into their high thread count sheets, you realize that the horizon isn't a line, it's a lid, and we're all just trapped in the pot. Working a cruise ship is a special kind of hell. It's 18-hour shifts, recycled air, and the constant rhythmic thrum of the engines that starts to vibrate in your molars. But the pay was good, and as a young chef looking to make a name, the Gorgon was supposed to be my golden ticket. I was in charge of the late-night services, which most people assume means flipping burgers for drunk college kids or plating fruit for insomniacs. For the first 6 months, that's exactly what it was. Then I met Chef Moretti. Moretti was the executive chef of the Platinum Tier, an exclusive invite-only dining experience that didn't appear on any of the ship's maps. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of old driftwood gray, weathered and perpetually smelling of expensive tobacco and raw iron. One Tuesday around 2000 M, while I was cleaning down the main galley, he walked in. He didn't look at me, he just looked at my knife work. "You have steady hands, Elias," he said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together, "but you're wasting them on melon balls and sliders. Do you want to see what real service looks like?" I was exhausted, my apron stained with grease, but the ambition in me screamed yes. He led me to the service elevator, the one that required a physical key, not just a key card. We didn't go up to the penthouse suites. We went down, past the crew quarters, past the engine rooms, down to deck 0. The air changed there. It was colder, heavy, with a humidity that felt oily against my skin. The kitchen on deck 0 was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't stainless steel and bright LEDs. It was black tile, copper fixtures, and a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. There were 4 other chefs there, all of them older, all of them silent. They were prepping things I didn't recognize. Organs that were too large to be from a cow. Translucent ribbons of meat that shimmered with a pale bioluminescent green under the dim lights. "The midnight buffet," Moretti whispered. "Not for the tourists, for the patrons." He handed me a knife. It was heavier than my global set, balanced perfectly but etched with symbols that made my eyes ache if I looked at them too long. He pointed to a slab of meat on the central block. It was pale, almost white, and it was moving. Not a lot. Just a slow, rhythmic contraction, like a heart that refused to believe it had been cut out of a chest. "Clean it," Moretti commanded. "Don't let the fluid touch the floor. Every drop is worth more than your life." I spent the next 4 hours in a fever dream of precision. I didn't ask questions. You don't ask questions when you see the kind of money that was being exchanged in the shadows of that ship. But as the weeks went by, the ingredients started to change. I started noticing the disappearances. On a ship with 5,000 passengers, people go missing more often than the cruise lines want to admit. A man overboard here, a sudden illness there. Usually it's chalked up to too much tequila and a low railing, but I started seeing the patterns. It was always the solo travelers. The ones who didn't have family waiting for them at the next port. The ones who spent their nights in the casino, losing money they didn't have until someone in a sharp suit whispered an alternative way to settle their debt. One night, I was tasked with fetching a specific crate from the deep freeze locker at the very back of deck 0. The door was heavy, reinforced with steel. When I opened it, the smell hit me first. It wasn't rot, it was sweet, like rotting lilies and honey. Inside, there weren't crates, there were hooks. And on those hooks weren't cows or pigs. They were draped in heavy plastic shrouds, but the shapes were unmistakable. I saw a hand, not a hoof, not a claw. A hand with a wedding ring still glinting on the ring finger under the freezer lights. It was a woman I'd seen 2 nights prior at the blackjack table. She'd been laughing, drinking a martini, complaining about her ex-husband. Now she was inventory. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. I wanted to scream, to run to the bridge and tell the captain, but then I remembered the captain's face when he visited Moretti the week before. He hadn't looked disgusted, he'd looked hungry. I realized then that the Cess Gorgon wasn't a ship, it was a floating slaughterhouse. The patrons weren't just wealthy travelers, they were something else, something that had outgrown the taste of normal food. They were the elite of the elite, people who had everything and realized that the only thing left to consume was us. The midnight buffet was served in a hidden ballroom behind the engine room's heat shields. I was forced to help plate the specialties that night. I stood behind a long, black marble table as the patrons filed in. They didn't wear tuxedos or evening gowns. They wore robes of heavy dark silk. They didn't speak. They just made this low, clicking sound in the back of their throats. I watched a billionaire tech mogul whose face I recognized from the cover of Forbes pick up a slice of the pale, rhythmic meat I'd prepared. He didn't use a fork. He used his fingers. As he ate, his eyes rolled back in his head, and his skin seemed to tighten, to glow with a sickly, youthful vigor. "The vitality," Moretti whispered in my ear, his breath cold as a grave. "It's all in the fear, Elias. That's why we don't use anesthesia. The adrenaline seasons the marrow." I knew then that I wouldn't survive the voyage. I was a witness. I was also fresh. Moretti had been eyeing my hands not for my knife skills, but for the density of the muscle. The escape wasn't cinematic. It was desperate and filthy. We were 3 days out from Miami, navigating through a storm that had the upper decks reeling with seasickness. On deck 0, the rocking was dampened, but the tension was explosive. I knew the inventory was low. Moretti had been looking at me with a predatory hunger all morning. I waited until the 3,000 AM service was at its peak. While the chefs were focused on the intricate plating of a heart of the deader tartare, I slipped away toward the waste disposal chutes. These are massive, high-pressure pipes that grind up food waste and eject it into the ocean. It's supposed to be environmentally friendly fish food. I grabbed a life vest from a maintenance locker, stuffed a waterproof bag with some cash I'd stolen from Moretti's office and my passport, and crawled into the secondary chute, the one they used for the non-organic scraps. The smell was enough to make me black out. It was a cocktail of chemical bleach and old blood. I heard the machinery groan. I knew if the sensors detected a blockage, the grinders would activate. I had maybe 30 seconds. I pushed. I slid through a slurry of gore and gray water, the darkness absolute, the sound of the ship's engines screaming in my ears. Just as I felt the vibration of the grinders starting up behind me, the pressure changed. I was shot out of the side of the hull like a piece of refuse. The impact with the Atlantic was like hitting a brick wall. The cold was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I surfaced in the wake of the Gorgon, watching that massive glowing mountain of iron and sin move away from me in the rain. It looked like a beautiful golden city on the water. No one on the upper decks, dancing to the live band or sipping champagne, had any idea that 30 feet below their feet, a man was being served as a side dish. I drifted for 16 hours. The salt burned my eyes, and the things I'd seen burned my mind. I was picked up by a Panamanian freighter. I told them I'd fallen overboard, a drunken accident. They didn't ask too many questions. They'd seen enough cruise ship accidents to know that sometimes it's better not to know the truth. I've been hiding ever since. I changed my name, I moved inland, but every time I see a commercial for a cruise, those bright, smiling faces, the all-you-can-eat promises, I feel that clicking sound in the back of my throat, because I know the truth. He is. I know the truth. They're selling a menu. And if you're not sitting at the table, you're on the plate. Don't ever go to the midnight buffet. I still have the knife. The one Moretti gave me. I stole it before I jumped. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the wind howls through the main pines, I look at the blade, the symbols on the metal. They've started to glow, and the meat I buy from the local butcher. When I hold the knife near it, the steak starts to pulse. They're looking for me, not because I know their secrets. The world is too blind to care about the truth, but because Moretti told me I had perfect marbling. And on those ships, they never like to waste a good cut of meat. If you're planning a trip this summer, if you're looking at those brochures of the Caribbean or the Mediterranean, do me a favor. Look at the staff, not the waiters in the clean white shirts, but the ones coming out of the service elevators at 2000 AM. Look at their eyes. If they look at you like you're a person, you're fine. But if they look at you like they're checking the ripeness of a peach, get off at the next port. Don't pack your bags. Don't wait for your deposit. Just run. Because once the moon hits its peak and the regular guests are asleep, the buffet opens, and you really don't want to know what's under the silver cloche. The first night I saw the lighthouse, I can still clearly recall it. On top of a deck that wasn't shown on any map, a single beam cut through the dense fog. Decala had never been mentioned in the announcement, but there it was, flashing dimly in the dark like a heartbeat. I'm Elliot Marston, a 32-year-old Seattle-based freelance photographer. I took this vacation in order to get away from it all and see the ocean in all of its moods. I'm obstinate, adventurous, and a little nervous in confined confines, but nothing could have prepared me for this. When the fog thickened unusually late at night, I walked the upper decks with my camera slung over my shoulder. The lighthouse suddenly materialized out of nowhere, its slowly revolving light practically calling out to me. There was a strange tug in my chest, as if it wanted me to come. It was too quiet on the decks. Everything was gone, even the distant laughter, the normal hum of the engines, and even the conversation of other night owls. As I got closer, the fog almost seemed to be alive, curling around my ankles. I turned to see that no one was there, but I believed I heard whispers riding the wind. A tall man in a dark outfit passed me in the corridor, but he disappeared when I blinked. He appeared to go unnoticed. I arrived at this phantom deck stairs. The keycard reader flashed up when I touched the door, even though it wasn't on the directory or the plan. I was invited in by a gentle chime. I swiped with a trembling hand and a pounding heart. The lighthouse room was round and small, with damp metal along the walls, like smoke and corroded iron. The strong scent of sea salt had a subtle acrid flavor. Distorted shadows were made on the walls by the light spinning from a bronze lantern that appeared to be centuries old. There was a faded plaque on the far wall. Deck L, for those who arrived before the storm. Water fell regularly from the ceiling, resonating like a slow drumbeat, but I had no idea what that meant. I put down my camera with the intention of taking a picture, but as soon as I glanced through the lens, the room appeared to change. Shadows twisted and stretched. Passengers in vintage clothing were silhouetted in the lantern's light, their pale features with big, meaningless smiles caught in mid-motion. The room was still empty, but there was a faint sound of distant laughter and soft music. A shiver went through my body. My flashlight wavered. A man in a captain's coat with dark, strangely reflected eyes was leaning against the wall in the corner. Even though he remained motionless and silent, I could sense him observing me. Curiosity held me there, even though I wanted to get away. The door banged behind me as I reached for it. Until the shadows on the walls stretched into shapes I couldn't identify, the lighthouse light continued to spin faster and faster. The ship's horn blasted somewhere above, distorted and out of sync, resonating unfathomably far away, like if it were intended just for me. That's when I understood this deck wasn't meant to be there, and none of the people who had previously set foot on it had ever come back. That night, if you can call it sleep, I hardly slept at all. The spinning lighthouse would always appear between my eyelids when I closed my eyes, illuminating a fog that I couldn't get rid of with its pale beam. Like a talisman, I kept my camera by my side in the hopes that it would record something solid and real to show that I wasn't insane. When morning finally arrived, the sunlight was dim, practically off. Deck L was gone. All I had to do was return to the vacant corridor, which was lined with cabins I knew well. However, my garments still had the lingering cold and the smell of iron and salt. Over breakfast, I met a Chicago passenger named Clara Jensen. She was in her mid-30s, happy, but just as curious as I was. She reported hearing faint music reverberating in the hallways late at night and seeing strange lights close to the upper decks. She confessed, her eyes darting anxiously to the ceiling. I thought I was imagining it. We decided to look into it jointly and decided to wait until dusk since it felt alive, somehow. Though I periodically caught glimpses of a tall man in a dark uniform, always vanishing when I stared directly. The crew appeared unaware of any odd activities. The fog had returned by 11:30 p.m., heavier and nearly luminous under the deck lights. Claire and I sneaked past the dozing hallways and made our way to the spot where I had first noticed the lighthouse. With each step, the moist, metallic smell of the air grew stronger. Then we caught sight of it. As though it had never been gone, Deck was back. The keycard reader was glowing, almost throbbing, appealing. Even though the deck above was deserted, I vowed I could hear the faint echo of footfall. The circular room inside felt cramped, tight, and oppressive. With every flicker of the lantern, shadows stretched strangely around the walls. No instrument or source was visible, but the music had increased in volume and was now playing a distorted waltz as though it were in the room with us. "Have you heard that?" Clara muttered. Out of the corner came a hollow, gentle, and unmistakably human laugh. The shadows swirled in patterns that suggested someone was moving just out of sight, but nothing was visible when I swung my flashlight. We cautiously investigated, crossing hitherto undiscovered puddles. Then a hand appeared from the floorboards by the lantern, pallid and dripping wet. I staggered back, dropping my camera to the ground as Clara shrieked. There was a spark of action caught by the lens. Someone was standing up, looking at us with eyes as black as ink and garments drenched and in tatters. I shivered and whispered, "Deck! Alive!" We turned to face the door after hearing a creak behind us. It was shutting slowly and deliberately on its own. When we rushed to force it open, we discovered that the corridor had changed. Hallways were impossible to navigate, and the numbers on the cabin doors were repeating in unreal patterns. Every step sounded as though we were plunging into the ocean. I recalled that quiet, unattainable voice from the lighthouse. "You're present. You have been selected." I looked at Clara, whose wide eyes mirrored my own fear. For a moment, I saw dozens of faces looking at us from the walls as the lamp flashed fiercely. These were passengers from past voyages, stuck forever, smiling as if nothing were wrong. The entire circular room was illuminated as the lighthouse beam rotated faster. With every turn, I saw figures approaching, reaching out, and then disappearing into the darkness as soon as I blinked. My breath was shallow and my heart was racing. No one was on deck, but a trumpet blasted somewhere deep within the ship, a distorted echo that seemed almost mocking, as like there was something moving and waiting beneath us. The water, like puddles beneath our feet, rippled. I firmly grasped Clara's arm. "We must leave immediately." The lantern's spinning light appeared to follow us as we scurried for the door, creating long, impossibly long shadows that lunged at our heels. The slick metal scraped my hands as I faltered and fell hard. Soft footsteps circled around us, encroaching, but there was nobody in sight. Then we heard it. Next to my ear was a dry, icy whisper. "You can't leave, not yet." We walked down the impossibly long hallways without saying anything. Every corridor appeared to go on forever, with doors repeating themselves in patterns and numbers as if the spacecraft were making fun of our own existence. I felt Clara shiver as I continued to hold her hand on her shoulder. Like if had a spirit of its own, the fog from the upper decks had infiltrated and was curling around the floor. The beam of the lantern continued to rotate above, revealing fleeting glimpses of passengers who ought to have long since vanished. Eyes that are hollow but staring straight at us, faces as pale as driftwood. With a subtle urging that made my stomach turn, one stranger held up a hand. I staggered back, almost tripping into a puddle of something darker and thicker than water.
"Don't stop," Clara muttered.
Her voice trembled, but it also carried resolve. She underestimated her courage. I looked about, but there was no way out. Stairs led nowhere, the corridors twisted, and the walls themselves appeared to pulse, growing and shrinking as if the ship had a heartbeat. I swear that I could hear gentle murmurs coming from behind every door, people urging me to join them and remain. Then we located it, a cabin that is numbered 0. The door was slightly open and dimly lit. The air inside was hotter, quite oppressive. In the middle was a music box that played a melancholy lullaby while spinning on its own. The tune encircled us like shackles. Clara let out a gasp. I saw papers strewn all over the floor and thought, "That music, it's following us." Decades-old passenger lists, crew logs and manifests, all with names I knew from the dimness of the corridors. My heartbeat quickened. Every name vanished as soon as I attempted to read it in its entirety. From the ceiling above came a loud splash, followed by another. Water poured down as though the ship itself were crying, not because of leaks. Faces formed from shifting puddles on the floor, with lips opening to utter our names and eyes blinking. I took hold of Clara and shoved her in the direction of the stairs from which we had come, but it was gone, replaced by a moist, slick, solid steel wall. I felt panic gnawing at me. The murmurs increased in volume, swirling and reverberating in every direction. Then I felt a damp, icy hand on my shoulder. With my beam trembling, I turned and saw him, the captain from Deck L. His eyes were deep, black, and reflective. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. But in my thoughts, I heard it. "You belong here now." I staggered back and fell hard after tripping over one of the puddle faces. I took a picture when my camera struck the ground. Dozens of figures, either drowned or rotting, but moving in spooky synchrony, rose up behind him as the flash illuminated them. They made a subtle but determined grab at us. We hurried along a winding hallway that hadn't existed just a moment before Clara shrieked and pulled me up. We were blinded by the lantern's quicker spin above, trying to drag us back. Shadows of hands blended with the fog and stretched hopelessly along the walls. I reached for my camera and started clicking frantically. A person wearing a captain's uniform had a melted face that was dripping like candle wax, but the flash captured it close enough for me to see it clearly. I felt like throwing up. The whispers abruptly ceased. Suffocating silence descended. There was a door ahead as the fog swirled. I had no other option, although I wasn't sure if it led out. I ran toward it with Clara. The walls moved once again as we grabbed for the handle. A distinct laugh reverberated throughout my skull, neither mechanical nor human. We glimpsed the night sky for the first time as I yanked the door wide and said, "No one leaves Deck L." Above the railing, the familiar water stretched infinity while stars twinkled. I felt a wave of relief, but then I saw the fog circling the upper decks. And the lighthouse beam rotated, surveying the ship, gleaming dimly over the ocean. There was an impending event. It was searching for us. Condensation made the handrail slippery under my fingertips, but I continued. Our sneakers splashed in puddles that seemed to form and disappear with every step as we ran along the deck, Clara's hand firmly holding mine. The metal groaned as though it held centuries' worth of sorrow, and the spacecraft squealed in protest. The lighthouse beam whirled over us, looking in all directions. With surgical precision, its light sliced through the fog, brighter than it should have been. It seemed like it was probing my heartbeat right there in my chest. Clara shivered and muttered, "Do you believe that anyone else has made it out alive?" Despite my fear of the truth, I shook my head. Shadowy creatures hovered at the edge of the fog, half seen, watching every time I turned to look back. They remained motionless, but it was impossible to tell if they were alive or dead because of the way the fog whirled about them. We ducked into the main passage, the passenger deck's familiar pathways, or at least what I believed to be them. The wet carpet curled at the edges and felt uncomfortable underfoot. A gentle tune drifted from behind cabin 19, and door numbers were mismatched and repeated. I went cold. The speakers were not the source of the music. The source was within the walls. The high-pitched, distorted sound of a child's laughter reverberated from the vent above. I felt sick to my stomach. Clara took hold of my arm. "Keep going." We reached the magnificent staircase. The stairs appeared longer than they should have been, and the railing was slippery and icy. The ship's buzz was nearly non-existent here, but I could hear water trickling. No, something heavier, like steady, rhythmical footfall. Then it showed up. With a faint glimmer, the elevator door opened by itself. I was aware that we shouldn't, but instinct took precedence. I dragged Clara along, and we entered. The panel's numbers were illogical. My stomach dropped on decks 13-7 and Deck L. We were wanting to get out of the lighthouse deck, so I hit the button for Deck L. The elevator lurched and hummed before coming to a stop. The doors led into a small hallway rather than a deck. The walls are made of damp stone and resemble an old cathedral. Behind us, I could hear the voices of every journey, the melted faces, the drowned. They weren't on the hunt. We were being herded by them, in the direction of something. At the end of the hallway, a dim illumination emerged. My beam bounced off of condensation-slick walls as I ran. An archway with lettering I couldn't understand but could feel was revealed by the glow. "Remain." Clara gasped when a hand touched her shoulder and said, "Belong." Nobody there, so I whirled. The only things that fold in on themselves are shadows. From the walls came a quiet, moist cough, and I heard a creak. The corridor came to a sudden stop. A gateway was produced by the radiance. The sea below was serene, but too dark and too still, and the lighthouse deck stretched unnaturally high beyond it. And a guy stood in the middle of the deck. The previous captain, with black eyes, a ragged yet spotless uniform, and a lantern that didn't cast any shadows. His quiet voice reverberated throughout my mind as he said, "You've come a long way. But who stays is determined by the light." Abruptly, fog whirled wildly, and dozens of figures rose up from the deck and the sea. With drenched hands and impossible smiles, they reached for us. Clara screamed as she nearly fell after her foot slipped when I pulled her back. I caught her in the act. I attempted to run, but the deck stretched indefinitely in front of me. The lantern was raised by the captain. I was struck squarely in the chest by the beam. My entire body went cold. I could feel my thoughts tugging in their direction, toward the fog, toward the sea below. Then I thought about the camera I had in my bag. I took it out and took picture after picture. The figures hesitated and flickered like holograms with each flash. This was their weakness, I understood. Light, the truth. Evidence that we were still outside of their domain. Clara spoke a barely heard murmur. "Are you sure we can make it?" I didn't respond. I continued to snap. The figures sprang closer as the captain's smile grew. My name was whispered by the cold, damp fog that pressed in. A chilly, damp hand touched my shoulder. I whirled, empty. The hold persisted. It was neither physical or human, yet I could feel it bending me in the direction of the railing. Something I hadn't previously observed was illuminated by the lighthouse beam as it revolved one final time. Mirrors covered the entire deck, reflecting the water, the fog, and the drowning people. Countless reflections, no more place to flee to. Then I noticed that the light from the lantern was spreading. The shadows were flinching and the whispering were dying down, but the lighthouse beam was no longer scanning the ship. We were being scanned by it. Clara yelling my name was the last thing I remembered before I was dragged into the fog. The captain spoke softly. "You can never leave the light, not now," and a chilly, damp hand wrapped around me. The fog was no longer just outside of us, it was inside of us. Every breath smelt like decay and brine. For a brief moment, I sensed Clara's fingers slipping from mine, as though she were already being drawn into the fog. Between me, the captain's lantern threw light that warped the limits of reality as it floated impossibly. His eyes were endless black holes, but his smile remained the same. As though my thoughts had transformed into his voice, he said, "The light chooses." In an attempt to employ the mirrors as a shield, I staggered in their direction. The numbers behind us increased with each reflection. The beaming smiles of people who had disappeared days earlier, the drowned, the twisted. They were waiting rather than fleeing. They anticipated my fatigue. I took hold of Clara's arm. "The elevator is necessary," I hissed, but there was no back corridor. The lighthouse deck stretched endlessly, every board saturated, every railing twisted, just fog and mirrors. After that, one of the reflections moved on its own. Neither Clara nor I are being mirrored. A little girl with black eyes, pale skin, and hair stuck to her face. Her mouth opened wide as she gestured toward the lantern, but no sound came. A scream without sound. "Fearful," Clara muttered. I turned to flee, but the mirrors rippled like water. "We shouldn't be here." My image stumbled, contorted, and grinned. A second hand clamped around my wrist, moist and icy. Not Clara's, not human. I went into panic. The figure disappeared like smoke when I waved the beam at it, but the fog grew closer more quickly. That's when I realized there was no deck on the lighthouse. It was a trap, a point of collection. Not only did the captain's lantern light up, it marked. Clara dragged me to the brink, each burst of light drawing us nearer to them, closer to being chosen. Far below, I could see the lake, calm yet black and boundless. It would take us in an instant if we made one mistake or slipped. With trembling hands, I grasped the lamp. It was nearly alive and heavier than it appeared. The shadows were momentarily burned as the light pierced the fog. The figures flinched. I came to see that the pictures I had shot earlier were wards, not just proof. Each flash pierced the fog as I took a few photos. Clara's shriek reverberated, far away but very next to me. An entire mass of faces, grasping, twisting, attempting to become one, surged out of the mirrors as a shadow. I sensed a tug toward the direction of the railing and the boundless black water. I stepped into the edge. I faltered. Clara let out a scream. In the hopes that the light might give us a moment, I flung the lantern. It burst into radiance, casting shadows into the mist. We crashed through the mirrors and slid backward into them. Our hands and arms were injured by the glass, yet we continued to move. We saw glimmers of the actual ship when the reflection cracked and splintered, but it always dragged us back into the lighthouse world. It was my final encounter with the skipper. He held up a hand as a caution not to stop us. Then he whispered. Then the world shook. The light never forgives. The deck, the mirrors, and the fog all became hazy. We were plummeting into an impossibility. Above us, the lighthouse lantern whirled brighter and faster until it was reduced to a white hot point, and our reflections blended with those of the drowned. The cruise deck was deserted when I opened my eyes. Quiet, no fog, not a lighthouse. Only the quiet, everyday hum of engines and the distant chatter of people in the air above. Clara, shivering and pallid, held onto my arm. We sprinted over to the closest cabin. The phones were dead when I tried to call security and let them know, and the lighthouse deck was gone when I peered out. There was no deck Ella anywhere on the map. I kept the camera by my side that night. All of my pictures of the lantern, the drowning people, and the never-ending fog were blank, each and every one. Clara said, "Did it really happen? I don't respond." The lighthouse deck is waiting somewhere, just outside the curtain of everyday life. Captain waits. The light is waiting. Furthermore, we remain linked. When I close my eyes, I sense it. A chilly touch brushed my shoulder, a whisper across the deck, and I remember every time the fog enters my thoughts,